And it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Staci Yutzie. Dr. Staci Yutzie has worked as a civilian in public safety for over 20 years, focusing on the application of research to improve program outcomes. She is the current National Institute of Justice Law Enforcement Advancing Data in Science, or LEADS Scholar, and is a training manager at Oregon's statewide Public Safety Training Academy, the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training, or DPSST. Staci has a bachelor's degree in law enforcement, a master's degree in justice management, and a doctor of education degree in organizational change and leadership. In Oregon, Staci leads the Center for Policing Excellence, a section established within DPSST by the legislature in 2013 to make policing more effective and efficient by bringing research to practitioners. There, she oversees a number of programs, including the Research Unit, Academy Programming and Curriculum, and Instructor Development. From 2017 to 2021, Staci led Oregon's efforts to completely redesign their police training academy with the goal of developing and implementing an academy training program that is grounded in research. This work earned DPSST the 2021 International Association of Chiefs of Police Leadership and Law Enforcement Research Award. Along with her research partners at Washington State University, Dr. Stephen James and Dr. Lois James, Staci co-authored an effectiveness evaluation of the Oregon Academy that was published in Interventions, Training, and Technologies for Improved Police Wellbeing and Performance in 2021. Staci is presented on Academy training at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference, at the National Symposium on Police Academies and Training. Additionally, she has provided testimony on law enforcement training to both Oregon's Task Force on Public Training and Accountability and California's Little Hoover Commission. Well, Staci, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, yeah, it's our pleasure. Absolutely. So we're excited to talk to you today about your research, the effectiveness evaluation of the Oregon State Revised Basic Police Academy curriculum. So I thought what we do, Staci, is I'm just going to read the abstract first, because I think that helps sets the foundation for us going forward. And then we'll get into some burning questions that we have for you about this research that you did. So your abstract reads, in 2013, the state of Oregon passed House Bill 3194, the Justice Reinvestment Act, resulting in the creation of the Oregon Center for Policing Excellence. One goal of the center was to revise the curriculum for the statewide Basic Police Academy with a focus on topics such as communications, crisis intervention, and procedural justice. This curriculum revision was then evaluated independently. A force option simulator was used to assess recruit interaction with community members. This allowed for a reliable and repeatable measurements tool to assess each cohort month after month. Evaluation of behavior changes in recruits from before to after curriculum revisions revealed significant improvements in key policing skills related to interacting with civilians in ways that build trust in police legitimacy, de-escalating hostile situations, and reducing the need for the use of force. This chapter describes the curriculum revision in detail and presents results and discusses them in light of police training moving forward. So that's the abstract from your report there, Staci. So first of all, I think, can you maybe start by telling us about a little bit of background on the state of policing in Oregon? I think many of our viewers are perhaps not familiar with the way it's structured there in Oregon. So with respect to the statewide training academy there, what is the role of DPSST, or the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training? What is that, and what's the mandate?
Yeah, so DPSST is, we're a little unique in the United States. We are Oregon's post agency, so we are the agency that sets the standards, but we are also the ones who deliver the basic police academy training. So it's not that it's developed on site and it's delivered somewhere else. It's all in one house. We're also unique because we're one of only a handful of centralized academies in the United States. So we're one of the few academies where every officer, deputy, trooper in the entire state comes to us for training. So they're all getting the same program in the same venues and typically the same instructors. Our basic police academy training is 640 hours over 16 weeks of training, so 40 hours a week for 16 weeks. They live on site at our campus. We have dorms and all of our facilities right there. And then that's followed by a period of field training that they go back and complete in their agencies. Our training is approved by a board. We have a 24-member board, but quite a bit of the training is starting, more and more of it is starting to come through different legislative mandates, different statutes. Oregon administrative rule kind of outlines some specific things, like we have to provide a certain number of hours of training on mental health. We have to provide training on pursuit driving and child abuse investigations. So there's a few kind of things throughout our 640 hours that we have to provide, but all of that then is approved ultimately by our DPSST board.
Okay, now your officers or your recruits that you train at your academy, are they already hired by police agencies? So they're already employed and they're coming there for training?
Yes, that's correct. They have to be hired by an agency in order to come to training with us.
Okay, and now in your study, you mentioned another aspect, and that is the Oregon Center for Policing Excellence. So can you tell us what is that and how is that related to DPSST?
Yeah, so in 2013, the Oregon legislature passed their Justice Reinvestment Act, which was largely focused on community corrections. But at the very end of about 25 pages of this House bill, there was this last kind of section that created this Center for Policing Excellence. And they housed us within the training division at DPSST. And the center was the purpose of it is that we were tasked with bridging research and practice. And specifically, we were given the goal to increase the effectiveness of policing in Oregon. And so we became part of the training division. Initially, we had a real external focus. We did a lot of training and technical support for our law enforcement constituents around the state. And then over time that we took on more of the internal work as well. And we took over academy programming and curriculum design and instructor development.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So now maybe give us a bit of background for this study. Because you talk about in your report, you talk about the training that existed before the revision, and then you undertook a change piece where you revised the curriculum amongst other things that you changed there. So what was the genesis for you to undertake this change in process?
Sure. So in 2013 and even later, we were a traditional police academy. We did the kind of traditional paramilitary style academy with our blocks of training. We had about 4 to 8 hours of training on a topic or a skill, 1 week of driving training and 1 week of firearms training, classroom lectures, marching, that kind of thing. But some of the drivers for change was really after the creation of the center and this real push towards thinking about evidence-based practices in policing, and not just what's done in our law enforcement agencies and what they're doing to address maybe crime or in how they interact with citizens. But we really started looking at the research and trying to figure out how it all applied to academy training. And it made sense that if we were going to have this external focus, that we really needed to look in-house as well, and that we need to think about how we could improve our training to better support officers being able to go back to their agencies and model these evidence-based practices. So we got interested in some research by Stephen and Lois James and Brian Vila at Washington State University. So they had published some research in 2016 on measuring officer performance and how to do that based on the officer behaviors in an encounter rather than kind of the traditional looking at the outcome of an encounter. And so we went up to Spokane, a group of us from the academy went up and met with them. And by 2017, we had a contract with them to help us to develop a new real science-based training academy. And this paper, that's really what it's about, is the evaluation of that work that we did with them. So I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but starting before we made any changes to the academy, just looking at collecting some real baseline data about what was happening with our training and what kind of behaviors and outcomes were we seeing with recruits, and how could we change that over time and influence the training outcomes.
Okay, great. So then that's a nice segue to get into the study here. So, and first in the background portion of your study, and I love it when researchers do this, where they make a very powerful, provocative statement, and you do this. You say that one of the great myths of policing is that training is selected based upon solid evidence that the training works and that it will effectively produce the desired result. So, okay, can you tell us about that? What was the groundwork or the rationale for that statement?
Sure. So I guess the elephant in the room is that there's really limited evidence that training even works. That's kind of a secret thing to say, right? From people who are training practitioners. This is our livelihood, but there's just not a lot of research. Research from outside of policing, just in kind of job training in general, tells us that most knowledge and skills that's learned in a training program doesn't transfer to the job. And similarly, in police training, there's just very little empirical kind of data or science-based evidence to tell us that. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but our police training evaluations, they tend to rely a lot on anecdotal evidence. It feels like it works. It seems like it works. I mean, I can see that it's working, right? But not a lot of real hard data. And also our evaluations really tend to not examine the impact of training on officer behavior, right? We kind of examine the impacts of training maybe at the end of training, but we don't really know what that really means when they walk out of the room. So if we're going to work to improve transfer of knowledge and skills, we really have to think about how we're measuring and examining this.
Right. Excellent. And so I think you used a key phrase there, and that is, one of the things that traditionally is done in the academy is we measure, or we think we're measuring, our students' performance at the end of training, that is an indicator of that they've actually learned something. And so we confuse performance improvements with actual learning. And you use the great terminology, the key words of retention and transfer is whatever skills that we're giving our officers, whether that's knowledge-based skills or practical skills, motor skills, can they actually retain those skills? And then does that transfer into the novel environments that they face on the street? And, we've previously interviewed Dr. Dawn and John O'Neill, who did their academy study, and what they found with their study is that within 6 weeks post-academy, the basic motor skills, the physical defensive tactic skills of the officers had deteriorated to pretty much non-operational after 6 weeks. So you bring up a good point, is how we need to make sure, how are we training and then evaluating our officers' skill. So you state it there that an evidence-based police training needs to be built upon two components. And those two components that you mentioned are content based upon valid crime and police science. That's number one. And delivery or training methodology must be based upon learning and education science. So dig deeper into this for us, Staci. Walk us through those two critical components. How did you identify those, and what do you mean by them?
Sure. So those components, those come from, if you're familiar with Dr. Gary Cordner, who's the academic dean of training at Baltimore Police Department, right? And those are really some things that he had identified in this world, this conversations around how do we develop really evidence-based police training? What does it look like? That it has to, it's a holistic thing. It has to include one thing. It's not just the topics that we're training, but really how are we going to do it? And so, police training, it tends to be really traditional. It's passed down from generation to kind of generation of officer. And, Dr. Bill Lewinsky, he talks about this as well. Academies tend to base their training on utility or opinion, kind of rather than science. So there's a growing movement that's kind of recognizing that what we are training, how we're deciding what to train, really needs some attention. And so often when we're looking at developing training content, a lot of times that's based on the experiences of the officer, the person who's developing the training. And unfortunately, this could include some real problems. It can include some inaccurate beliefs. It can include like some longstanding kind of myths that have been passed down from generation to generation. When we look at delivery methods, again, it's very traditional. A lot of it's like, I was trained this way as an officer, and now I'm going to train you this way as an officer. It's very lecture based. We often use stress ineffectively. We don't use good feedback models and good coaching when we're using kind of scenario or reality based training, but it's just sort of, that's the way we've always done it. And so if we're really going to evolve our training practices and develop more evidence-based training, we need to look at, what is valid content? What does the science tell us is really actually relevant and applicable to policing today? And we need delivery methodologies that are based on actual effective learning principles, the science of information processing, and how do we design training that is for that long-term learning, right? That it's there for them to transfer that knowledge and skills and go out into a new situation and apply information differently. And how do we go about developing critical thinking skills? And there's a science to that approach. And just that traditional way that we've delivered training isn't going to get us there.
So before you undertook the revisions that you did in your academy, then, as you look back at that time, was it your perspective that both your curriculum at that time as well as the method of delivery was very in that traditional, basically block model, very linear type of instruction? And so what did you see there when you explored that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what we saw. We had big blocks of training where sequencing maybe wasn't the priority. Often it's designed for efficiency, or when we can get a venue space, or when we could get certain instructors. Very classroom, not only lecture heavy, but even discouraging of conversation. Recruits would stand and ask permission to ask a question, which led to they didn't really want to ask a question, that they just kind of sat there and they were just passive receivers of information. And so, yeah, we saw all of those things happening in our program.
And along with that, I'm wondering if you saw this too, but one thing that I witness within that type of environment typically is a training culture or a learning culture that is really not conducive to our students wanting to explore, to be able to make mistakes, to be able to learn from error. And so they're petrified of even making a mistake. They think they're constantly being evaluated. And so culture that's created by the training cadre is very critical, isn't it? It can either lead to a very positive learning environment, or it can actually destroy learning.
Right. You know, we say now, like, we recognize that we want them to make mistakes in the academy. That's part of learning. It's part of especially how adults learn, is through kind of making a mistake and being able to kind of evaluate the why that happened. And when we had that other model of training, we would get the comments that when we'd send them to scenario training, they called it no win, no win village. They knew that they were going to get, it was a gotcha kind of a thing. They were going to get berated by an instructor for, 10 things that you screwed up in this vehicle stop, right? All of those things became jokes in a really unfortunate way that all just really took away from the learning that should have been occurring.
Okay, so there was obviously a great need for some revision and change that had to take place. So let's look at get into a bit of your methodology here, Staci. So you spoke about your literature review that you did as part of your methodology, and so that's obviously a critical part of any research project. So tell us about the robust literature review that you did. How did you approach this?
Sure. So when we began our partnership with Stephen Lois at WSU, they were already publishing their research on measuring police performance. And it was that research is what brought me to them in the first place. So they had already been involved in a number of studies on police training. And during this time, I was also completing my doctoral research, which was on police training at the academy. And so I had spent several years kind of this deep dive into the literature, what studies exist on training. I think we've probably listed most of them today, right? The O'Neill study, there's not a lot out there. But studies looking at academy operations, or what kind of instructional approaches, what kind of standards exist. So I had spent several years working on that. And this literature review really was kind of a coming together of my work looking at what existed on academy training, and Stephen Lois's work on evaluating training. And that's kind of how the literature review was born for this study.
Okay, great. And so then you mentioned, basically, to set the foundation, you mentioned in your report 2 categories of basic academy methods or philosophies of approaching training. And you kind of mentioned already a little bit about stress training. So I know that, that's kind of what you're referring to there, is that one methodology, the stress-based approach. And then the other method that you talk about is the collegiate approach. So let's go deeper into that. What is meant by these, and how do you define? So how would I know, for example, if I walked into a training academy, what type of things would I see where I would go, oh, okay, this is what Staci was referring to as a stress-based approach versus a collegiate approach. So give me some indicators of those.
Yeah, a stress-based approach is one that's going to be typically modeled after kind of like a military boot camp. A lot of times there's paramilitary, military style drill, inspections, maybe some pretty intense physical demands, maybe even some kind of physical demands combined with public discipline. These kinds of academies tend to really emphasize structure and discipline, but maybe not so much emphasizing learning and critical thinking and problem solving kind of competencies. And they tend to really rely on these ineffective learning methodologies. It's what we were in Oregon, right? It was the very lecture focused and the the evaluators or instructors, like I'm the expert of this, and I'm going to tell you what I would do in this situation, and not really making space for the learners to kind of achieve that. And then the other kind of end of that is more of a collegiate academy or a non-stress academy. These are delivered in more of a relaxed kind of atmosphere. They're going to have more emphasis on academic achievement. They may use more kind of administrative disciplinary procedures. Maybe they're not doing the push-ups, maybe they're writing a paper in response to something that has been problematic. You're going to see more supportive relationships between instructors and recruits compared to the maybe more drill instructor type of interactions. And these kinds of academies, they align their training more with adult learning practices. They're more likely to develop training that's going to enhance critical thinking and be thinking about effective communication type of training.
Okay, so, and I wouldn't want to leave our viewers with the wrong impression here, because when you have these two categories where you say stress-based, you're not referring to the fact that you're not saying there's no place for stress-based training in the police academy or for high intensity physical exertion in the police academy. You're basically referring to a full culture of stress, almost to the point of a crushing abusiveness throughout the academy. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, there's absolutely a place for stress in police training. Just historically, we haven't used stress effectively, right? When we create stress in those kinds of ways, with the yelling and that kind of thing, we're not creating the sort of natural stress that occurs on the job, right? We do need to create those natural stressful kind of learning environments for our recruits. Absolutely. So a non-stress or a collegiate academy, it is a little misleading and it could sound kind of negative, but there is a place for stress. It's just a different kind of stress.
Right. And I guess an example of that, I was in an academy in a state not long ago where there was a recruit class in, and the recruits were not able to speak up unless they were spoken to. They couldn't talk. I was a guest there. I was watching them. They were not allowed to even interact with me. They used, for example, fitness as discipline. So if you did something wrong, fitness was used as a discipline. And then I think, we wonder why there's an epidemic of obesity in law enforcement and why cops typically hate a lifestyle of fitness, is because 6 months of abuse in the academy is sure to scar them against desiring that as a lifestyle. So I think you make some great points there. Now, you mentioned this idea that we often hear so much about, and that is blocked training or siloed training, and what the impact of blocked or siloed training is on learning. So what did you find in your review in your academy about the extent of block training? And well, maybe start with that, and then, but tell us what. Who cares? Why is block training a problem? Why should we even care about it?
Yeah, so we certainly operated fully with this block training model. Our training was very siloed. Again, it's a very traditional method used in academy training. And we tend to have these kind of long blocks of training. Pretty much all of our training was either in a 4 or an 8 hour block. And sometimes that went on for days, right? So we would have an entire week in the 16 weeks that was, this is your week to learn driving training. And now this is your week to learn firearms. The first probably 2 weeks of the academy were exclusively sitting in a classroom, just being passive receivers of information. And again, while it's really efficient and easy to schedule, it's not efficient for learning. When we train this way in these really independent silos, we're not integrating knowledge and skills. We need to integrate it into like a more complete officer or a more kind of holistic framework. And when we train in these ways, those long periods of time of lecture and block training, it creates a lot of problems. It's not good. There's low long-term retention for learning. Again, we're not integrating concepts. We tell our, remind our trainers when our officers go out in the field, it's not, hey, today is the day I'm responding to domestic violence calls. It's, you're working through a number of things on any given day. It's also a lot easier when you train and you're going to apply a skill in isolation. It's easier to perform it than to perform it in a broader, more kind of dynamic situation. So we're not doing our recruits any favors by just training things in isolation and then expecting that they're going to be able to perform this thing in a far more complex environment. So it focuses so much on the attention of one component skill, but we're missing the bigger picture about what actually is existing outside of the training environment. So when we start to look at integrating training and how we're creating opportunities that allow our recruits to kind of practice a whole task, see how this skill or this knowledge fits into kind of a broader context. And same with block learning, block style lecture training. It might be really efficient to get like a big group of folks through training and you can check off, training is completed. But it's really inefficient for developing critical thinking, which at the end of the day is really what we're trying to accomplish.
Right. And so now my understanding is, and you can confirm this or correct me, but this problem with block learning, this is not a law enforcement specific issue, right? Like when you look at multiple domains outside of law enforcement, sporting, firefighting, search and rescue, medicine, aviation, is the same findings are what we see is that block training is absolutely the worst way to structure a training environment for optimal learning. Is that your understanding?
It is. And it's funny because the world of education has known this for a long time. And it seems it's kind of a newer conversation for law enforcement training. And really, the For Science study and the O'Neill study, it was kind of one of the groundbreaking things that made it kind of okay for law enforcement to have this conversation, that the way we've been doing it isn't the way to do it.
Right. And I think what maybe makes that worse is, and if we're going to be honest, the majority of our entire education system, both primary and post-secondary, still is primarily a block model of instruction. And so we've got this long history of indoctrination of, oh, that's the way that you design and deliver training.
Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So I was interested to read, and this kind of surprised me. I didn't expect to see this in your report, this idea of stories. You talk about stories by trainers and the role in learning and in the academy that stories play. So what is the role of trainers telling stories? We often refer to those as war stories, right? I still remember when I went through the academy in 1990, I still vividly remember some powerful stories that my trainers told about that were related and connected to the objective of what we were learning. And those had a very powerful influence on my learning and my performance as a police officer. So what did you find here? Like, how do you validate stories as being helpful for learning versus are there also concerns or dangers when those stories become counterproductive to learning?
Yeah, so you really nailed it when you said the stories that you remember from 1990, because they were related and they were related to the objectives and they were powerful, right? There is a place for, we learn often when things are connected to an emotion, and a great, well-used story can do that, can kind of create that emotional connection for our learners. And stories they're a really traditional, almost informal delivery method. They're very commonly used in police training, but we do have to be careful with them because they can be problematic. And I don't know that the stories, the example that you're giving is the norm for what is often used, because often stories they're kind of idealized, or they're told for entertainment value, or they're funny, and they may have some limited value because they might be limited to the experiences that the storyteller had, and it's coming from their limited perspective. Also, these stories can be part of what kind of becomes the informal curriculum, right? There's the formal curriculum that's on paper, but then sometimes a story could be even contrary to that, right? We see this sometimes with topics around maybe even use of force or implicit bias, or things where we're trying to deliver one message, but then we want to tell a funny story that maybe is demonstrating the opposite of the thing I'm trying to teach recruits to do. Like, I could be reinforcing some problematic behaviors if we're not careful with our storytelling. And then the other thing we like to think about is that does delivering learning in this way, does it really align with learning principles? So adult learners, they really need to make use of their experiences. That's part of their learning and their training process. And it's also really important for our learners to perceive training as relevant to their needs. And when our learners perceive training to be relevant to their needs, then it produces higher rates of knowledge and skill transfer. And so it's really important that we help establish that value for our recruits. And the value may not be them hearing from someone else about their mistake or their learning. The value may need to come from the recruits. We may need to dig deep with them and help them understand, why is this important? Why is this thing that we're talking about really important, and helping find a way for them to establish value. So I think we just have to be careful with stories and think about why are we telling this story, or how many stories have I told today during this training session? And is there an opportunity for me here as the instructor to ask my recruits, do you have an example, right? Do you have an example? And that can be a really powerful learning tool. Oh my gosh, my peer has had this experience, right? It's a little different than always kind of coming from the instructor in the room.
Absolutely. And, as you're talking, I just recalled a great example of that on a course I delivered recently, where one of my students, we were talking about attention and focus and emotional regulation and some skills to be able to help with that. And one of my students spoke about how when she was driving home in a snowstorm once, she went off the road and she flipped her car and ended up upside down in her car. And she spoke about all these things that we were trying to relate to. This is what you might experience in policing. And she gave the whole class a very powerful example from her own experience that had nothing to do with policing, but I can guarantee you those students were very impacted by her story. So, and, you bring up a good point, use the word motivation or the why. And, this was Simon Sinek's whole thing, right? Start with why, and the connection between our students' motivation when they understand the reason, the connection for why I'm learning this skill, it can be a really powerful learning tool. So now, something very important, I think, that you mentioned in the issue of student assessments or training assessments. So you mentioned that you found that training assessments tended to focus on knowledge retention and student perception of the training. So this is prior to the revision, right? So help us understand, why are both of these problematic? Why is knowledge retention and student perception, their subjective perception of their training, why are those problematic for validating training?
Yeah, Yeah, we tend to not just us, it's very common, right? That when you come kind of complete a training, that you'll do a little smile sheet, right? Here's your evaluation. Did you like it? And that's a very common way that we assess training. And it does tell us something, right? It does give us information as instructors. It does gives us some things to think about. But the learner's perception of whether they liked or didn't like the training isn't really an assessment about their learning. Did learning occur? We could use that kind of assessment to think about, were there barriers to the learning that happened in the training? There's things that we could kind of make adjustments, but whether they liked it or not doesn't really mean that they've learned anything or not. Often our learners don't really know what's best for them, right? They don't often know what they need to learn. They think in fact, a lot of times they will lean to wanting some lecture-based training. Just tell me the information, just tell me what I need to know. It's really uncomfortable for them to have to be put into a situation where they have to think for themselves or justify a decision. And so whether they like it or not, kind of that lower level assessment isn't really that useful for us. And then the other thing we tend to do is we assess their performance right at the end of a training block. And so, I think you mentioned this earlier, there's sort of that perception, I'm looking at this person, they can complete the skill that we've just spent 4 hours training on. So check, yeah, they obviously can do it. I can see that they can do it. Or vice versa, they can't do it. We've just spent 4 hours working on this and they still can't do it. So no, they haven't learned the skill. But neither of those things take into consideration the actual process of information processing that happens in our brains and in our learners' brains, right? There's a lot that really goes into the process of consolidation of memory. It could take 3 to 5 sleep cycles to consolidate information in our brains. And so when we assess a skill or kind of a quick knowledge check at the end of something, we don't really know that means it's going to be there a week later, a month later, 2 months later, and now they're out in the field and they need this information. We just don't know that it's going to be there with those kinds of assessments.
Okay, so let's get into your revision process now. Tell us about the process that you undertook to deconstruct, if I can use that word, deconstruct your training curriculum and then rebuild it. As I understand it, the length of the academy did not change. The total number of hours did not change. Now, there were some changes in the amount of hours that were dedicated to this or that topic, and I think some topics went out all together. So tell us about your process and your redesign of the revision.
Yeah, so we did a complete rebuild. We said, really, let's start from scratch, and it just started with this conversation, right? What does today's officer, what knowledge, skills, and abilities do they need prior to entering field training? It also was a little bit of kind of separating for us that we are training to prepare an officer for field training. We can't possibly prepare someone for their entire career, right, in a 16-week academy. But what could we really focus on to develop really strong foundational skills that would be carried on and built upon? So we ran constituent focus groups. We conducted surveys. We examined lots of research. We invited community partners to come to the table. We invited, for the first time ever, community members to come to the table, perhaps even community members who were not pro-police, pro-law enforcement. But we just really sought out to get different perspectives to kind of help us make these really critical training decisions. We invited, obviously, lots of subject matter experts. And through this process, we significantly realigned our hours. We weren't able to expand the academy. It's a huge cost. We weren't given any extra budget. In fact, we were told that our changes couldn't influence the cost of training. So we had to go through and really get critical and make some hard decisions around what was like need to have and nice to have training. Because if you ask officers, they need it all. But at the end of the day, we had to make some really hard decisions. We eliminated topics entirely. We reduced hours significantly. And then we doubled hours. We doubled the hours that focused on those community interactions, those social interactions that a lot of our study is based on. We redistributed our scenario training hours. They were all kind of lumped into the latter half of the academy, and we stretched them out so that we start in week 1. So we just did a lot of like moving and shuffling. And we did our changes in a series of phases because it was a monster project. And our first phase, we just really focused on making a shift to our methodologies, looking at more active learning. We started retraining our instructors. We started breaking apart those blocks of training, spacing them out, kind of integrating our topics more. And then in the second phase, we really changed the structure and delivery of how we do skill training and scenario training. And then the third phase was kind of a big cleanup, like what all was left, closed gaps, made different kinds of adjustments. And the foundation for all of this are really this work that Stephen Lois had done on measuring officer performance, right? That really became kind of the underlying foundation of our training.
Okay. And as part of that, now you mentioned what you termed to be golden threads. So as you were looking at those key performance knowledge and skills that your officers had to have, you identified certain skills that you called golden threads, and you said these were woven throughout the entire academy. So I think that's very important. How did you identify what is a golden thread, and how did you interweave it throughout the curriculum?
Yeah, in that early research and those conversations and those focus groups, we started to identify these things that were really concepts that were so important that if an officer didn't possess them, it really didn't matter what else we did with training. And so the first one was really about officer wellness. We knew, and the research tells us, if we don't have healthy, resilient, well-rested officers, right? We really can't expect these people to make decisions. They're humans performing under human conditions, and that these things were really important. And so we had to put a real emphasis on resiliency and wellness throughout. Another one was emotional intelligence. So we knew that officers who lacked some real self-awareness and self-regulation skills, that they were going to struggle with community interactions. Even if we taught them, here's how you speak to somebody, right? They still have to possess some awareness and some ability to manage their reactions to things. We knew that officers who lacked EI would struggle with decision-making and personal accountability. And so at the end, it didn't matter, right, what we taught them about ethics or use of force, right? If they didn't really have these kind of underlying skills, then the rest of the training was going to be kind of for nothing. So we took these concepts and some others, and we weaved them throughout the 16 weeks. So right off the bat, they have classes on these topics. They have a resiliency class, and they have an emotional intelligence series. Those are in week 1 kind of classes for them. But then those things kind of come up throughout. So the competencies of EI come up in procedural justice and in ethics and in vehicle stops and criminal investigations. Sometimes it's just more of a subtle kind of retrieval of these concepts, and sometimes it's a little more blatant approach where we'll say, hey, how does your self-awareness impact your interaction that you're having right now with this individual in a scenario.
Okay. And so, but whether they were strategic or subtle, or intentional or subtle, they were all strategic, right? So yes. In the sense that your goal was to try to build connective tissue to that skill and connect it to all of the different aspects and contextual variability that an officer might find him or herself in. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And so now, so you mentioned the content change. Okay. So I think we're very clear on that. You identified what were the critical knowledge, skills, and abilities that officers needed to have. You weren't training them for career law enforcement. You were training them for the field training officer phase. So what were those initial critical skills they needed to have to enter into that phase? But then there's you talk about the how the training is delivered. That also changed, didn't it? There was a significant philosophical shift in how instruction was given. And I think there was training that your trainers were given to shift them into more of an adult learning pedagogical approach to training. So I'm curious whenever I read that, because I know the culture of law enforcement, the old saying is culture eats policy for breakfast. So what did you find with your training cadre? Were they fully endorsing and embracing this shift? Did you get some resistance? What did you experience?
This was hard. This was probably the hardest part. We have a mix of full and part-time instructors. We have about probably 40 full-time and about 300 part-time instructors. And so just the scope of changing that was pretty significant. So we started out, we developed some classes, some instructor development classes on facilitated learning. And we thought, great, we've done it. We've created a class and we're training them, and it's going to be fine. And it wasn't enough. So then we started developing, okay, we need more instructor development. We need more opportunities. We created little modules on adult learning and effective coaching and feedback and how we want people to interact when evaluating a scenario. And we focused on our full-time instructors first, because it was really difficult to get training out to all of our instructor cadre. We realized pretty quickly they needed a lot more support beyond the training. So we would sit down then and do kind of a walkthrough, like a tabletop walkthrough of a course, talking about how do you run a learning activity, practicing that. We did a lot of sitting in and observing them delivering courses early on, and then we would do a lot of quick coaching on the breaks. Hard. It was really difficult. And we knew that they weren't all going to make it. They weren't all going to make the change with us. So there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of doubt. What is this crazy thing that you're doing? This isn't how we do it. But slowly we started seeing them buy into the change. And it usually followed a positive experience. They would be teaching in a classroom and something would happen. And we started hearing instructors saying, wow, you can see the students' light bulbs going off. Like, this is a really smart class. And once they started buying in, and we started trying to leverage change management, right? We're trying to leverage the folks who were buying in to help us train these other instructors, or now you give some coaching to this instructor who's still struggling to buy in. And we parted ways with a lot of instructors. And some of it was their decision, that this was just not something that they were wanting to do. And sometimes it was our choice that people were just not going to make the change. And so then over time, as we hired new instructors, we were really assessing instructor skills differently. We were looking for these people to be coaches and mentors. We were looking for people that could do this, to deliver training in this way. And it took a lot of time and a lot of effort, but they love it now. It's way more enjoyable for an instructor to interact and engage with a class this way than to just lecture at them for hours and click through PowerPoint slides. And they really see the value in it for students. So it's an ongoing process for us. We've actually recognized we need an entire instructor development program we're now creating a dedicated program for that. And it will be a continued effort.
Absolutely. Consistent pressure constantly applied in the right direction. Right. So, okay, let's get to, I guess, starting where the rubber meets the road now. So your evaluation. So you identified your new curriculum content, you restructured your methodology, how you're going to deliver it, and then you did an evaluation. So walk us through that process. How did you accomplish the evaluation? And as I understand it, reading your chapter, you used a simulator or virtual technology to help accomplish that. So what did you do?
We did. So at the end of each training cohort, so in week 16 of each cohort's training, Dr. James comes down to the academy and he runs every recruit through a series of 6 video simulations. WSU designed these scenarios specifically for assessing these interactions. So they run them through. There's a domestic disturbance. There's a vehicle stop. There's a suspicious person call, investigation of suspicious person or circumstances, a disturbance of the peace, and a welfare check. And sorry, my cat is going to come up onto the desk. What happens when you try to do this at home? So 3 of the scenarios are these social interaction scenarios, and they can end in either a positive, a neutral, or a lethal encounter, and that depends on the actions of the recruit. 3 of the scenarios are a use of force that are predetermined to end in 1 or 2 deadly encounters, and those are allocated to them at random. And the scenarios, they were recorded back at WSU, like I said, for these purposes. And then Steve records the students performing the scenarios, and he takes them back to WSU where he codes them. He's looking for these behavior metrics that we've embedded throughout the 16 weeks of training. And when